Welcome to Hansik House, the podcast where we discuss the future of Korean culture. I'm one of your co-hosts, Michael Lee, and I'm joined by...
Hi, I'm Kim.
And everyone, last week we had the first chance to discuss the idea of value in Korean culture, what we value within our society, what we value more than things from our society, unfortunately, and possible ways that we can begin to disrupt that perspective, something that we as Koreans, Korean Americans, but I think overall non-Caucasians, non-Europeans, non-Americans, the rest of the world, we struggle to deal with this very dominant culture, which is Western culture, and that affects and influences us all.
So for this episode, we wanted to talk about something that Koreans are really good at, and we value this thing a lot. The entire world admires us for this.
Education.
Yes, this week we wanted to talk about education system in Korea.
But we're not going to make this episode about some boring lecture on what a Korean education is
No
and how
way.
to share it with the rest of the world. We're going to actually make it a little bit interesting. We're going to give you guys a little bit of a secret, a little bit of a glimpse into Korean society, and we're going to share a little bit of our insider knowledge. We're going to show you or share with you why Korean international students are the way they are.
Why?
There's nothing wrong with them, but there is already a tension right now between Koreans who are born abroad and Koreans who are born in Korea. And my intuition and what I've learned about this it all comes down to education. That our fundamental difference in character between these demographics is because of education. And for anybody like myself who grew up outside of Korea, we've had these times where we've come up against Korean international students and we just don't get it.
I think it's not only about Korean international students, but also people that came from Korea. Korean Americans have hard time understanding or interacting with.
Right. So this is an opportunity for us, and myself even, to open up this window and
explore
provide
the
and explore
reasons
this.
why.
Exactly. And be able to build up a relationship and a bit of empathy. That's really my goal. A bit of empathy and understand how the other half lives.
I wanted to have Michael understand how Korean education system is like. So first thing that I did is type Korean education in Google. I encourage you guys to do this in order to get the basic idea of it.
Yeah, it's pretty astonishing how far Korea has come just because of how much they invest and push education.
Right.
But it also, just from a short, let's say, Wikipedia page reading, you get to understand what effects it's beginning to have on the society.
Number one, our population literacy rate is almost 100%.
Right, and that's incredible.
100%.
That's incredible for any country.
It's the country where average age of 15 years old student has the most high stability of reading and writing amongst OECD nations. And also, Korea is a country where they think education system is the third most important factor in life. You see a lot of international students. The reason why is we are the third largest country that send students to America. The first is China, second is India. We sent 72,000 people to the United States.
Every year.
Every year.
And we have the highest percentage of people going abroad. So compared to, because China's a big country, they send a lot of students abroad, but we're an extremely small nation. And actually, among all nations, we send the highest ratio of students to the US to study. And that's why we see so many 유학생들 and international students today.
But if you talk to individuals in Korea, they will tell you that education system is one thing that they have to change.
So I'm going to be a little bit stereotypical, but I want to make a point because that provides a foundation of discussion. When you think of the typical international student, right? You think of the typical international Korean student. Let's keep that picture in our head for a second. For the most part, you would think of someone who's very reserved and very quiet in the classroom. They might be very social amongst their friends, or they might drink a lot on the weekends or whatever. But when you look at them in the educational context, they don't ask a lot of questions. They're very reserved. Ryu's right next to me, and I know when she sits in class, she's not as active as, let's say, people who are born in the US. And for them and for us, it's easy to say that it's because of the language barrier. That when people first come here, it's a hard time learning English. It's their first time studying abroad, and they need a transition time to become more proactive and engaged with the rest of American society. The thing is, I don't believe that's true. I don't believe that just because of language, it prevents an engagement. Because when you look at other ethnicities in other countries, when they engage with the US, it's a whole different story. My hunch is that their demeanor, that their personalities have been so finely tuned by the educational system in Korea. And Ryu will explain in a minute, but the way they are raised with the certain expectations of education that they have among their family and friends and all of society in the country, and you will see that that impact has an undeniable effect on the way these personalities come and why, let's say, the stereotypical Korean international student is the way they are. It's not because of just language. It is because of the way they have been raised for the previous 18 or 22 years or whatever amount of years they were before they came abroad. And if the one group of Koreans raised outside of Korea is to make any real emotional headway and relationships with people from Korea, I believe that this is the starting point that we have to discuss and really truly understand, because it is the fundamental foundation in which Korean Americans and Korean Koreans diverge. So Ryu, can you tell the audience, as you've told me,
Right.
what it's like to be a student in
Okay.
Korea and why you even end up abroad? Let's end up there. Let's bring this conversation all the way through and show everyone listening what your route was personally.
I want to describe how the classroom looks like in order to make you understand. In the US, you move around between classes to take different subjects, right?
Right, and as we go older in, let's say, middle school and high school, we get
Right.
to choose some of our classes.
Right. In Korea, in the beginning of the semester, the first day, which is March 2nd, you go into school and your class is already assigned. They tell you should go to classroom number 1, 2, or 3. And they assign you a seat, you sit down. Teacher comes in once an hour, different teachers. And you just literally sit down the entire day.
But you're sitting in the same spot.
You're
the
sitting in the
entire day.
same spot, wearing uniform the entire day. Different teachers come in and they teach you different subjects.
And you have no choice.
You have no choice, the schedule is given, and you just watch teacher teaching you. You don't really look at other people's faces. If you look behind to talk to your friends during class time, you get yelled at. Really embarrassing. Sometimes they bring this like
A long like stick to hit your hands or the back of the knees.
right,
or
if
whatever.
you don't listen to them. Well, that got diminished because parents
Complained a lot.
but that's the basic educational scene in Korea throughout pretty much middle school to high school.
Well, so what if you're a student who doesn't enjoy, let's say, science as much?
You don't have any option. If you fall asleep during the class hours, you get yelled at. Sometimes teachers just consider you as like a failure-looking person sleeping during the
But what
class.
if you want to study, let's say, woodshop or art or music over the traditional subjects?
Well, pretty much you don't have any option to choose a class of your interest because the schedule is given by the school, because the school and the teachers are very influential figures that help you decide. Well, not necessarily help you. They decide everything for you and you follow.
Well, why? Where do you end up at the end of that? Why do they put kids through this system that, for me as an American, sounds suffocating?
Well, we talked about this on the first episode too, but everything in Korean education is geared towards to scores, the score that you need to earn in order to go to college. If you understand Korean, we say this as 입시 위주 교육. I can translate that into college entrance oriented educational system.
That's all that public schooling is.
Private
That's what
schooling
it's made
too.
to be.
So teachers, although they might have philosophy of teaching and education, they usually don't deliver that. Students don't really care about anything else but score to go to college, because if you read Wikipedia that we mentioned earlier, Korean education is geared towards for college that eventually leads you to secure jobs at government, bank, or big companies.
So if you look at more studies, so if you Google these things and look for different references, there is a general consensus from many foreign scholars and people who study this culture that Korea is very specific because the society believes that education is what provides basically their entire livelihoods. That ultimately education will be their only route for social mobility. That it will secure them a job. It will secure them prestige and respect. It'll secure them a wife or a husband. It'll secure them a future lifestyle. It'll secure them happiness. And it will secure them an entire way of life that they will live on. So to put it very simply, the 16 years of education from throughout high school and in the first 4 years of college, those 16 years or X amount of years in education will determine the lifestyle for your next 80 or so years. That your decisions and the way you study as a child will determine everything about what you will become later on.
We researched where this education model came from. In the early 1900s, when Japanese colonized Korea, they brought in this classroom system with a mission to raise populations to be basically servants.
So you can imagine why they wanted this kind of classroom system. The students didn't have any free will, any freedom. They had no choice. They had to learn exactly what the person was telling them who was in control, the Japanese.
Right.
Over
The
Koreans.
teacher that tells you this knowledge, you can question it. You only look at teacher's face as a higher being that deliver you knowledge that you have to use for the rest of your life.
Right. And there was no right or wrong. It was just what they said.
Right.
That was what you had to believe. That was what you had to think. And that was what you had to follow.
So when I first came to the US, I was really shocked by how American students are engaging in the class with teachers. Sometimes they interrupt teachers and sometimes they create discussions on their own. Compared to the experience that I had, it was a completely culture shocking moment.
And that system is now more than a century old. We are still using that system.
Right.
Even though Korea was liberated from Japanese control in the mid-1900s, we're still using that. And if that was a tool of subjugation back then, of one nation having power over another, why are we still using that system now? Why do we still abide by this educational process? And why do we still agree to use an educational strategy that produces the passiveness it did back then, this obedience? Who is controlling who in this situation?
Well, I want to point out that they changed a lot of educational programs and models throughout the time, but the fundamental structure, the frame is still the same.
Now, if this doesn't make you feel very uncomfortable already, there's something quite worse. We've created a new system that is producing even more problems on top of what we experienced with the traditional public schooling. And that is the idea of a hagwon. Now, hagwons can be simply translated into after-school schooling in the US.
It's a private education.
It's private education. You pay per hour or for a slight tuition, and after school, you go to a classroom, you learn more. You learn more about, let's say, you have SAT hagwons or you have English hagwons. You learn more about how to pass a certain test or how to improve a certain skill. In the US, we have things like Kumon, for instance.
Mm-hmm.
The thing is, in Korea, it's specifically geared towards helping achieve something in terms of getting a high score on SATs or passing a TOEFL exam. And hagwons, these study centers, have become this enormous economic powerhouse in Korea. They have been so widely successful that the average student, the majority of students in Korea will spend an enormous amount of time and money in a hagwon. And that is finishing school at 4:30 or 5 o'clock in the afternoon and then spending from that time until 9 or 10 p.m. every day and then all throughout the weekend studying. And this is how they spend, let's say, almost the entirety of their young lives in
Right.
middle school and in high school.
If you
sports.
pursue something outside of the study environments like art or gymnastics, you still have to go to this hagwon because they teach you how to learn some of the techniques that will guarantee you to go to college.
And we, as the Hansik House hosts and as this podcast, we want to foster a lot of discussion, and we don't want to necessarily put forward just our judgments. But this is one thing that we believe is a very negative aspect of Korean society. It is taking, because our generation is the first generation of Koreans who are studying in mass quantities abroad. Our colleagues, the young people from their late 20s and younger, they're studying abroad when their parents never did or could.
Mm-hmm.
And what is happening is that this extreme anxiety that families, parents, society in general has about sending their kids, sending the younger generation abroad to study, or just even within the country to places like Seoul National University or Korea University, these top level schools, there is so much anxiety because the older generation just didn't have that opportunity. And because of this anxiety, people are taking advantage of the anxious. It's like telling everyone that a flood is coming and then selling them the insurance on their house. That's what it feels like. There is all of this ungrounded anxiety about sending children to schools and passing the SATs and passing the TOEFL exams and getting the recommendations written and going to good colleges and setting up, basically, like we described before, the fundamental foundation for their future happiness and success in life. There is so much anxiety at the age of 16 or 18 or 12 even, that so much money is being funneled into these places where Hagwon teachers are claiming that they can get your kid into Harvard or get a perfect score on the SATs or all these things.
It's funny because Hagwon teachers are usually enrolled in this agency, like celebrities have their own agency that manages your schedule. So you can imagine Hagwon teachers are almost equivalent as celebrities, admired by these young students and moms really zealous about education.
And it's not unheard of that a family will spend more money on Hagwon learning than they do on the regular schooling. So they'll spend tens of thousands, even hundreds of thousands of dollars a year preparing their children to go to a higher level institution, or specifically abroad. So when you see an international student from Korea in the US, it's very, very likely that they spent almost the entirety of their childhood with their heads in books, preparing to be in that very place. When the rest of us were playing sports and having a lot of vacation time and spending time outdoors with our friends and making social relationships, a lot of these children, a lot of these students, when they were younger, were being coerced indirectly by their families or friends, by society in general, this stressful environment of competition, to be in basically a cubicle and try to learn English or trying to pass the SATs or trying to pass the TOEFL exams. That is the environment that has been fostered by Korea's education system and this new education which was created by Hagwons. So this podcast specifically, this episode of the podcast, is less of a call to discussion and more of a call to action between us as a Korean society. That it takes a good amount of empathy to understand the other side. And by God, I've known the differences between international students and American-born Koreans. I've experienced them. I know the perceptions we have of one another. I know the breaks in culture that seemingly cannot be mended. I know the differences that can be very off-putting. And it's so easy to write off the other as just being something that we just cannot understand. But I've understood through a lot of this research and a lot of these discussions with some of my closest friends, including Rue, who is a yuaksang, an international student, that it takes an enormous amount of thinking and empathy to bridge those gaps. And I can understand now that our cultural differences are done on purpose. They're created on purpose. And I, as an American born, have been afforded so many opportunities and so much freedom in a way that I don't even think most Koreans will understand. This ability to pursue a life that I want. And even here right now to speak to you all on this podcast is in a way because of that mindset and that opportunity that our culture has afforded us. Now, the average yuaksang, the average international student, is going to be coming to America because they want that opportunity. They want to open up, whether they know it or not, they want to open up their talents and interests and future so that they can pursue a life that they could not in Korea. And if you listen to this system and you begin to understand other systems, including the economic systems, including the familial systems, including the way Koreans live, work, eat, and die in the country, then you'll begin to understand why so many people come from the country to the US. And the real opportunity here is us as American-borns to help them understand and transition into this context, and for vice versa, for them to help us understand the context in which, let's say, our parents are from, a lot of our friends are from, or maybe some of us are from too. Only by doing this can we make both our contexts stronger and create a much heavier anchor, a cultural anchor that makes us feel secure to one another. And in that way be more connected by things more than just food or drink, but by the attitude in which we live our lives, by the talents that we hold, by the cultural wisdoms that we live by.
Some of our podcast listeners probably have gone through a Korean education system, or we know people who have experienced this. So the Korean education model that we have was really good to produce working force that devoted building Korea past decades. But with the projective mind that we have at this point, it's very imperative that we talk about our knowledge and wisdom to visit our education model again for our next generation, whose quality of life and expectations in living in Korea will be very different than ours, especially with the influx of immigration populations, changes of demographics in Korea, new technological developments, and other variables too in the future. What is the new look of Korean education? What do you guys think?
So, we all know that there are ways of educating children beyond purely books, test scores, exams, and so forth. We all know that there are ways to diversify education, so it's not purely confined to the classroom or the cubicle or the library desk. That is the mission of this episode, to take our extremely diverse, international, of all demographic experiences, reflect on them, and use those reflections to reform what this system can be in the coming years. Because what it has been for the last couple decades, the last century, and we're not just talking about within Korea, but also how that education system has migrated with our families to the US and abroad. That system cannot be the way it is in the years to come. Until next time, this is Michael Lee.
And we're Kim.
From Hansik House, looking for a new Korean future together.
Bye-bye.
So.